thank you all very much. You've given us a lot to think about and debate. And Dr. Deisseroth, I want to begin with you, but I think all of you probably will have thoughts about all of these questions, so please feel free to jump in right after they're directed to any one of you. So Dr. Deisseroth, some of your work is very sci-fi-like, you know, this idea that you just shine a light into the brain, you turn neurons on and off, you make people less shy, less anxious, more sociable, whatever it is, and it makes us somewhat uncomfortable, right? It's this idea of, we like to think of ourselves as sort of thinking, feeling beings in control of ourselves and shaped by our experience, and not just sets of neurons that can be turned on or off by light. So given all that we've been hearing about today about the mistrust in science and the sort of the way that public sees science these days, how do you think you can talk about your work without making people want to run in the other direction?
Good question.
Really important question, and I'm the first to say how unsettling it is that we can change essentially, you know, instantaneously how much an animal wants of something and how hard they're willing to work for it for almost anything, any primary drive. We can, you know, modify perceptions and complex cognitions, and that does raise these ethical and philosophical questions. At the most basic level, you know, what really is the nature of personal responsibility if actions arise, as they indubitably do, from a few blips of activity in a few cells? And this is something that is a longer conversation than maybe we have time for, but to not avoid it is very important also, because these are ways we can actually use this to bring people into science. It's very interesting. You know, when I teach undergraduates and I show them some of the things that are happening that we can do, first they are unsettled. They want to run the other way, and then they, you know, if you take some time and it's almost like not to overuse the psychiatry analogy, but it's a little bit like a therapy session. If I give enough space and time for the undergraduates to think about it, talk to each other, talk to me, then they get really engaged. And the prospect, I can see people wanting to come in, wanting to explore fields in new ways. And so giving time, giving space, and working with people, acknowledging the disturbing aspects and making clear the opportunities is absolutely critical. And, you know, it's the many other aspects of these questions are very important to consider. You know, what could we modify if we were able to do so in human beings? And here, the natural quick answers, you know, you have to treat with caution. You know, we don't want to modify necessarily what people want or how much they want it. Those variations are very important. That's critical to who we are as the human family, and a very thoughtful discussion is important around those issues. And as one example is different ways people approach problems, different speeds of cognition. It's not necessarily best to be fastest to the answer, or to get to the most efficient solution. And this is an important point I like to stress, that we want to emphasize the diversity of ways that human minds work, and to not let this capability that we are developing affect that inclusiveness.
Well, that's fascinating. And Dr. Shendure, this is actually very similar to things I wanted to ask you, but yeah, go ahead.
So I guess two thoughts. I think I think increasingly, especially with kind of the, you know, Karl's work, other work in the last couple of years, I think, I mean, kind of like your question, that blurring between science fiction and reality is getting closer. And I think I had, you know, dismissed, I think, concerns about the time horizon on which we, you know, I think to Victor's point from the intro, that you know, we'll accomplish less than we think we will in the next year, but over the next 10 years, we're probably going to go a lot further than we thought. And I think it's a tough balance, because on one hand, I think it's important not to, you know, in terms of how we communicate and discuss this with the public, it's important to, you know, be accurate, not sensationalize. You know, these organoids aren't thinking, you know, that kind of thing, right? On the other hand, you know, you can see paths towards dystopian futures, right? And I do think it's important to have those discussions proactively and, transparently with some recognition of the fact that, those aren't science fiction anymore. And we do need to think about it and put in boundaries and all of those things, right? So.
Dr. Malin and Dr. Bibbins-Domingo, what about you? I mean, when you think about things like this that have the potential to arouse mistrust in people, that's particularly true for some groups of people. And so how do you make sure that those aren't the people who may actually benefit the most and yet are most afraid to benefit from it because there's so much a history of mistrust there?
Yeah, well, I'll just jump in and say I think that it comes back to some of the things that we talked about in the first panel. I think it is a responsibility for scientists to do good science, and then to also understand the context, just like my fellow panelists just mentioned, but then also to ultimately, whether it's through journals or through other lay communication, be able to communicate also the context. And I don't think it's responsible science to just throw our hand back and say, well, we just do the science and we leave the communications to other people, because that is just the seeds of all of the miscommunication and allowing other people to control the message. And I'm not communicating about topics nearly as cool or complex as my colleagues, but I do communicate oftentimes in the space of active mistrust about issues of importance in public health. And I think that in those, taking the time and meeting people where they are and recognizing that people oftentimes have very clear reason why they have gotten to this point, and trying to understand that is part and parcel of helping to do what I think is part of our function, which is to educate ultimately about what a scientific discovery means.
I've been called complex, but I haven't been called cool. Excited about that. So I come from a background of artificial intelligence, and so I'll speak at it from that perspective. And as soon as you say AI, people automatically go, right? Like it's one of those things that we've seen a lot of what can go wrong with it, where if you don't control automation, or you don't put checks and balances, or you don't put humans in the loop, or you don't acknowledge that the data has come from humans to begin with, you run into this risk of perpetuating biases and perpetuating disparities that you knew existed, but now you've really done it at scale. So this is a problem that it only is fixed if you acknowledge that from the outset the technology isn't necessarily going to address the humanity. And so we've had a really challenging trouble. We've had a hard time really going back to communities to engage with them, to explain to them even what that technology is. And so there's this. It's challenging to the point where you need to raise the level of understanding of just what technology is in that regard. And so that's an investment that I don't think that we realized needed to be made from the outset, because first we wanted to say just how do you actually build AI in a way that's actually going to be useful, where you do demonstration projects and people go, oh, this is worth investing in because you can actually change lives with this. And then you get to that point, now you have to take a step back and you have to go, okay, now everybody needs to understand what we're doing. And that's kind of where we are now, right? We have not really hit the precipice where the technology is ready to be used by everybody all the time. So I think we have a little bit of time to get to the basics, get everybody some foundational education. And that's where we need to be.
I think this idea of timing, when do you communicate, is super important. That's what I'm hearing here over and over. So Dr. Malin, yes, okay, with AI, maybe we have a little bit more time, but Dr. Shendure, when you were talking about next-gen sequencing and neonatal screening, I was thinking, I don't know that the average person really knows that those things are going on, or that that's technology that came from their taxpayer dollars. I mean, we've talked about mRNA a bunch of times now, but the main issue, right, was that we didn't communicate that enough. People didn't know that was actually going on for 20 years.
It was the fastest adopted test in the history of molecular tests, right? It was overnight. You have a kid 2 years later, totally different testing regime, So yeah,
but
not a lot of communication about it.
So is that something that people should know? And you talked about the sort of long process to getting to a technology, getting to an innovation. And when in that long process do you start to communicate? 'Cause I imagine you don't want to overpromise, but you also don't want to take people by surprise.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that, honestly. I wish I did. I mean, just thinking about RNA vaccines and that, like, I don't think the public would have been that interested 4 years ago, right, in the nuances of RNA modification and that kind of thing, right, the way they are now. So it's a hard thing to know, but I think, minimally, when you can see that you're at that transformational moment, I think at a bare minimum, I think that's where there's some obligation to be very proactive about it. But it would be nice if we had ways of getting ahead of the curve, so to speak.
In the case of the RNA vaccines, would the time have been as soon as we knew that those vaccines were coming, like a year from now? And so we should start talking about them now, normalize them, talk about them is that the time? Or is it, as Dr. Malin was saying, even before that, we should start to think about the technology still maturing and getting to a point where it's useful?
I think we can second guess, right? But I think that maybe the broader point here is that we just need a more general education of the public about the things that we do in the lab and what to worry about and what not to worry about. And I think that you don't know when the next big thing is going to come from, right? So if you had a more general understanding that was more elevated, I think that would, in many ways, the current moment is an opportunity to do that, right? Because I think there is heightened interest in many of these things from the pandemic.
Could I say two things here? One, you have a challenge on your hand in that you can't get people excited to learn unless you can give them something tangible. And so just trying to teach people science or trying to teach them technology without giving them something to latch onto is not going to work for most people. A lot of people are very visual thinkers, they're very tactile thinkers, and so if you can't give them something that they can relate to out of the gate, you're lost. The second issue, though, because this comes back to when do you engage with people, is that when you have that, you have to translate the terms into something that's easier for people to digest. Because the majority, I hate to say it, the majority of people in the world could not tell you what RNA is. Okay? And so you say RNA vaccine, they might know what a vaccine is. They're not going to necessarily know what the difference is between RNA and DNA. Same thing with like automation. If you ask somebody like, what's artificial intelligence? A lot of people will look at you and go, Google. And you're like, no, Google's not necessarily artificial intelligence. And then they go, Alexa. And you're like, oh, okay, so that's the conversation we're having, right? But that's, now you have an in, right? Now you have something that people have had experience with in their life. And you're like, okay, so now imagine Alexa at your bedside, right? Now imagine Alexa making a decision about where this suture is going to go within the body. Now you can have something where there's this discussion. But if you come in too early, it's really challenging to get people to really think about what you're offering to them.
I think we're having the conversation, which is very focused on the very specifics of a new discovery or new technology. A lot of this is just about creating a general basic science literacy and a sort of basic narrative about what it means to have people in science and medicine engaging in a range of research. I mean, I like the comment this morning that the mRNA vaccines came overnight, but no, they didn't. They came on 10 years of research. And there's a way in which I think when we communicate only the boom and bust of a new discovery, it misses the fact that we have lots of people engaged in this wonderful enterprise in science and medicine, that we could probably communicate a little bit more of the mundane, or at least the fact that there's a lot going on that's working to improve health. And that at least would lay the groundwork for what we're talking about.
I want to talk about what happens to once you have these technologies in place. And, I was going through the airport recently and it immediately knew who I was. I didn't have to talk to anybody. I didn't have to do fingerprints, nothing. And on the one hand, great, you can get through really quickly. But on the other hand, okay, so now the government knows what I look like exactly. And I think, when the commercial companies get a hold of that kind of data, there's all these Clear and all these other companies just waiting. So what happens when those companies get a hold of the data? Is that our future? Is there anything we can do to prevent it? And should we even bother to?
Oh, we could have a long conversation about this. So there is a fundamental trade-off between, if you're going to talk about data, there is a fundamental trade-off between the utility that you get out of that data and the potential intrusiveness that it has on not just an individual, but the group that that individual, subpopulation that that individual represents. And that's, at the end of the day, that's a societal discussion about where do you strike the balance between the two of them. And I think that we've seen over time the pendulum swings in that, you know, when something bad happens, people are willing to give up their data for anything. So if like you have like a pandemic on your hand, easy to collect data, super easy to collect data. Now, here we are several years later, and what we're starting to see is everybody saying, we need more data sharing. It's like, but it's not as imminent at the moment. And so it's not as easy to actually share data at the moment. And we're kind of like starting to swing back a little bit towards where we were before. So in this respect, there has to be not just a discussion about what are the trade-offs, but you have to make it easy to make that decision. So once you're in a closed situation with data sharing, and people don't want to where they currently have, like, they have my data set, I'm going to analyze it, and then damn that journal, if they're asking me for a copy of it, I don't want to give them to them, right? You have to make it easy for them to make that decision, to push the data out the door. And you don't necessarily have to have it where the data has to be completely public for everybody in the world to inspect, but you have to make it usable and you have to make it available when the time is right. And that's the important part. Like, what is that timing, right? So if I had a data set where it had like fully identified information on everybody and it was like a population of HIV positive individuals, that's not necessarily a data set that most people feel comfortable putting out into the public domain. But I may study it. And then there needs to be an opportunity to give other people to come in and study it as well. But I'm going to have the right checks and balances in place to do so. What exactly those are, that's a longer discussion.
But it's a very important discussion,
Oh,
right? I mean, we're talking about, for example, now women being penalized for getting an abortion, which that data is just available from these health trackers. And Dr. Deisseroth, I want to pull you in here too. I mean, your technology seems to me to have particular potential for misuse. So really, I'm trying to think about, like, what happens when commercial interests get in the way of some of these things, these developments that we're talking about that have potential for benefit.
Yeah, psychiatry has been, in medicine, has been at the forefront of many of these issues with, personal health issues that may be very sensitive, that could affect employment, that could affect opportunities more broadly. And what's really interesting is now we're seeing as neuroscience progresses, psychiatry is now, I think, being asked to play a broader role in some sense, interpreting normal or adaptive variations in human capabilities, whether cognitive abilities or others. And this extends to the normal, typical ranges of how human beings vary, and then how it verges into the pathological when you get to even disturbing things like sociopathy. And so this field has a lot to say in principle for the public, to the public, but it has to be done extremely carefully, because as exciting as the advances are that we're making, we also don't quite know nearly enough to play the role that society seems to be asking of us now. And we are so this is the challenge we're facing is how do we give the public, as they deserve and need, a flavor of how far science has come, how exciting it is, how the insights into ourselves and the history of the human family, how fast and powerfully they've progressed, and at the same time interject this note of caution that we can't provide necessarily all the answers or even most of the answers that people would want right now. And here we have, science communication is so critical. Those of us who reach out to the public, we have to stick to the truth. We have to make sure there's no wiggle room there, that we do not verge beyond what is absolutely known and true. The public deserves to know the truth, and they're also smart, and they tend to know as well, as they should, when they're getting the straight talk. But then at the same time, that the appetite that they have is so great for this scientific truth. It's probably greater than many of us realize. We all wish, when we see some scientific communication being done, we wish it probably could be done better, but we have to support ourselves as a scientific and medical community to those who are doing it right, to help them, support them, amplify them. And so this mix of excitement and caution is what is the path we need to take, and I think that's what we're trying to do.
So, your work, Dr. Deisseroth, you talked about how it brought together chemistry, engineering, all these different disciplines, and I think a lot of the things we've been talking about takes a lot of different disciplines to come together. And how do you reward those? I've been hearing for years that academia doesn't know how to reward these kinds of collaborations, and yet a lot of the money is for those kinds of collaborations now. And how do you balance that with sort of individual investigator-driven innovation, bottom up, as Dr. Shendure was talking about?
We've been working hard on amplifying the credit for broad multi-person teams, to making sure that people are recognized as 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people who are jointly equally involved in a discovery or an effort, and doing everything we can to make sure, both within the scientific community and outside, that sort of shared or joint credit and appreciation is shared. So that's one big, very critical step, because you have people, you have a chemist, you've got a doctor, you've got a biologist, you have an engineer, and these 4 types of people bring incredibly different perspectives, each essential, and none of them is subsidiary, and this is something we all can do as a scientific and medical community, is work hard to make sure that such shared contributions are equally appreciated.
Dr. Shendure, I know you have thoughts.
Yeah, so I'll agree with everything Karl said, but just kind of one more thought. I do think collaborations are great, but I think there's also, it is increasingly the case that you see, I'm sure this is the case in your lab too, Karl, that trainees who are equally comfortable in RStudio and Python as they are at the bench, completely hybrid, right? And I think you can't beat that. That's worth more than a collaboration, right? Having that duality in a single person or a single mind, and I'm sure in other sorts of combinations of fields as well. And it does, bringing it back to kind of this being the medicine academy, like it does, some of the thoughts raised earlier, it does make me, I do have this persistent concern that there are many aspects in science where I think interdisciplinary individuals are becoming more common to great effect. But as a point I think raised earlier today, as medical education seems to be becoming more clinical, that interdisciplinary physician scientist, I think, is ironically, less common than maybe 20, 30 years ago. So,
Dr. Bibbins-Domingo, what are you seeing from the publication perspective? Are you seeing more of the innovation that he's talking about, or do you see still the group thing?
Yeah, I think that as journals, I think probably the biggest journals in the respective fields have gotten there because they have a history, and with that history oftentimes can come with it not being aware of all of the new things that are on the horizon. I think the responsibility for journals is to stay as fresh as the research is staying, to be able to catch the best research that comes into a journal, to have the people who can evaluate it, to be able to put it, to be able to vet it through peer review and to put it in context. with regards to these aspects of sort of multidisciplinary teams, it's amazing how each of our different disciplines have their own traditions on how they publish and what a publication looks like in one field versus another field. And I think that is sort of a challenge for multidisciplinary teams, and I think it's the responsibility of the academy to help these types of teams be able to articulate a publication in this journal means this. And I think we've tried to do that, I know, at UCSF, to recognize contributions on teams as a part of the promotion process, to allow investigators to give more narrative about their specific contributions. Their contributions might be new code or something else, to value those types of things. And I think that we have to understand that there are many things that contribute to what makes really extraordinary discoveries like this, and then figure out how the academy can value that and understand that for an individual.
I actually want to switch gears and talk about racial equity, but I think people can start lining up for questions. I'll go to them as soon as I'm done asking this question. So you've talked about, all of us and how successful that was, and mindful recruitment, and all of that is great if you have people in place to do the recruiting. But this morning we heard about how there's underrepresentation of Black scientists, for example, and I think in fiscal year 2021, 2.6% of NIH applications were from Black scientists. So, if the pipeline is broken, can you actually fix what's at the end?
Yeah, it's a great question. It has sort of, I would say, multiple areas that I would respond. So one is that the fact of only 2.6% of Black scientists is a travesty that needs to be corrected. It is not directly, it is related to the representation we want in clinical studies. But I would say the responsibility to diversify our clinical studies is a responsibility of all of us. It's not the responsibility of the 2.6% of Black scientists. And we want those 2.6% of Black scientists, hopefully more, to be engaged in every type of research, not necessarily only research that's related to a population with which they might identify. And so I think we have to solve both. We have to recognize that both are issues. They are related, but they're not the same issues. And I do think that we have to tackle both. I will say that I think fundamentally, just like I believe that we make new discoveries when we explore the broad variation of human biology and human behavior and human response, I think we also learn more by having a diverse workforce that thinks about questions in different ways.
Anybody else want to jump in here? Otherwise, we're going to go to questions. Okay. So we'll start taking questions, but again, I would please like to remind you that these should be questions. And I'm a journalist, so I don't really feel as many qualms about cutting people off. We'll start over here.
Hi, John White from Philadelphia. An actual question. I'm wondering if you can help sort of reconcile, on the one hand, the long lead time for discoveries and the sometimes unpredictable applications of those discoveries with the notion of community engagement and community consultation. When and how should that be part of the process? Is it only sort of when we get to late-stage translational clinical trial kinds of things, or is there a way to plug in community voices at much earlier points in terms of the broader issues of scientific discovery? Thanks.
Way earlier. I'm serious. I mean, right now, I would say the majority of scientific investigation is done within the scientific community, and it's not done in partnership with the communities that it can potentially have an implication for. And this is a problem because it actually moves the science and the technology development in a direction that is under the control solely of the scientists who are doing it. And that's great from the perspective of innovation for innovation. It's not great from the perspective of designing something in an ergonomic manner that's appropriate for society. And so one of the things that I think we recognized a long time ago at Vanderbilt was that community advisory boards were critical in the creation of our biorepository that we use in combination with our medical records for research purposes. I mean, actually, Jeff could probably speak about this better than I can historically, but this was something that we had them embedded even before we began doing research. And this was, there were questions about what research should be done even. Like what populations should be studied? Do we have blind spots in the development of the technology that we're building? I think if you don't give the opportunity for the populations that are going to be impacted to have a seat at the table, you'll never know what could have happened from the outset.
Just add a little bit. There are, I think your question kind of applied to clinically facing topics, but there are, for example, in stem cell research, there are approval committees that are university-based where there is, at least at our university, there is some community representation, right? So even in a space that is not necessarily directly leading to trials or things like that, just getting input from the community on whether they're comfortable with the rationale and the specifics or the kinds of experiments we're proposing.
Hi, Flora Winston from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and University of Pennsylvania. Very interesting panel, and wish we had much longer to talk about it. I was thinking a lot about the question was, when do we talk to the public? And because these are really very challenging topics, what I think is missing is the influencers of the public. When do we talk to the influencers of the public? When do we talk to the people who make decisions for that public? So I think about IRBs, I think about so many others, and what is the way that we can start to have consistent language, jargon across the fields so that we better understand what technologists are talking about. I'm a pediatrician engineer, so I understand that divide in language. But really, I think we're missing something here, and I want you to think about who are the people that the public turn to, and are we talking to them? Because they're not coming necessarily to, the news all the time. They're coming to social media, they're coming to their families, they're talking to their pastor or somebody else.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, so I agree with you, and I think when you look at the groups that do this well, they're not talking study by study, they're talking about sort of partnerships with community organizations, community leaders, that are sort of longer term, where there is both the one-on-one, but there's a lot of translation right across and for us at UCSF, this was a lot that happened during COVID, which was really about partnering with these community organizations to then together think about, well, what studies and what care delivery, and so that wasn't about every single community member. It was partnering with other trusted institutions within the community, together then setting the agenda for what was going to happen. So I agree with you, but it does require this sort of sustained view of what you're doing. It's not that you assemble this for like one study.
My friend Flora is from Mass General Hospital. I really appreciate all the conversation here. Really good to hear also about how to engage the community in terms of the capacity building, the co-creation, co-developing our research agenda, and all the work that you're all doing. One of the things that come to mind when we think about the bench to bedside approach and why we want to enhance diversity in our research studies, one of the problems that we encounter is that even if people want to participate in the research study, when that goes into the bedside for treatment, their insurance will not cover. So I'm just wondering, or they don't have access to the treatments or therapies that are developed from that innovation. So it's difficult for them to reconcile why participate in a research trial when I may not see a downstream benefit, to your point, where people need to see something tangible. So I'm just wondering, in your experience, if you can give us some tips on how to navigate reconciling this in the community that you're involved in your research.
I totally agree with you. We make recommendations in the report about how CMS, Medicare, and Medicaid could create incentives, how they could engage more community practices and safety net hospitals in research. That is something that I think would help in diversifying, but also it creates access in many cases to new discoveries. But ultimately, we live in an environment where we have a large fraction of the population that is still uninsured, that still doesn't have access to all of the technologies, and that is the broader context within which we're talking about new discovery. So I totally agree that remains the challenge.
Myron Weissouth from Johns Hopkins. 7 years ago, I was a leader of a clinical trials network sponsored by the NIH in the US and Canada, and I learned that in Canada you cannot identify patients or subjects by either appearance of race or self-identification of race. So what do we do to achieve diversity in clinical trials in the absence of an ability to utilize or document race as likely to occur in admission to universities?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think what the committee, when we looked at this question, we were interested in using self-identified race as would be the standard. I would say that, and to think about other variables that can help us think about diversity across different dimensions, language access, regional access. We were very interested in rural access for things. So I think there are a number of dimensions that you could think about across the broad range of science that's funded and conducted in the U.S., what you would want to know to ensure that it's available to people and that the discoveries are based on the range of people. I think with race, it is important that that identifying a self-reported race and ethnicity as a social construct is why should that lead you to make different biological discoveries? I'm often asked, is there a danger in reifying biological concepts of race by saying this is our goal? And I think that we as a committee came down very strongly on underscoring that race is a social construct, but that that based on principles of fairness and principles just on sort of broadly speaking the broad ways in which we are all going to contribute to biological diversity, that it's important to do this. Race is in some ways a poor proxy to do that in that self-identified race, but it's probably the best we have. And you're right, we're in a dynamic environment where it might not be what we have in the future.
So you have a short game and a long game here. So the short game is there are barriers that are put up with respect to what information can be collected or are permitted for use for an investigation. So it's not just in the US and Canada that you've run into these problems. We've seen similar things with clinical trials that have run through certain European countries as well. So France is the exact same situation, which begs the question of, so what do you do in the short game? Short game, you may look at other variables, fine. But I think that in the long game, which is really where we need to be thinking about this, is why are we in this situation as we are? What happened within society to bring us to that point? And then try to work backwards from there to figure out how do we address that issue? Is it a matter of trust? Is it a matter of a penalization for something that happened in the past? And if so, is it something that could be addressed? I think each of the countries, each of the populations in which this has happened, has been handled in different ways. And I suspect that what's happened, if you were to solve it in France, for instance, you would not solve it in Canada. And so this is something that requires a longer investigation into how do you go about building back the trust that would allow you to get that information and reuse it. Sorry, that's just my perspective.
Hi, Ted Abel at the University of Iowa. I had a sort of a philosophical question, actually, about the elbow that you talked about, probably Jay. And that comes from two things. One is Thomas Kuhn and his idea of paradigms that constrain our ability to accept new ideas, even when the data tells us that that's what's happening. And also the RNA vaccines and the work that was done in the mid to late 80s by Caitlin Greco, which people just didn't believe you could put these things on cells and they would work. And they had a lot of work to do to develop that, but that was a lot of work done really going uphill. So I wonder how much of this delay of getting up the elbow is really a conceptual challenge for us, for the scientists, and our inability to accept these new ideas and these new approaches.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think, maybe this connects to kind of another point I didn't get a chance to make. Historically, I think this kind of free-ended technology exploration for its own sake, so to speak, has probably been less appreciated or funded than it might otherwise be. I think that, at least I've seen in my career so far, I felt like that has changed to some degree. But for every one of these threads that leads to an elbow, there's 100 threads that didn't, right? And it's just a maze of exploration where you're just trying ideas and trying to make better educated guesses about which way to go. And I don't think any of that is very predictable at the get-go. It's a pretty empirical science of this kind of, low amplitude tech dev, right? So I guess it's a long way of saying I see your point. I do think to some degree it's a cultural problem in science, but the best way we can solve that is simply supporting more, basic science and tech dev for its own sake without worrying too much about where it's going. Right.
We have only about a minute left, but Dr. Deisseroth, I want to give you the last word on this.
Uh-oh.
You're muted. You're muted.
I don't think
Okay,
I'm...
now we can hear you.
Okay. I'll just, in the last word sort of way, I'll just say that, people care about people more than anything, more than ideas even. And this is something scientists and doctors don't know as well as politicians. Politicians always start with a human story. They start with a human being. They tell about the challenges, and they build a bridge from there to possible solutions. I think that's what gets us from these early moments, helps us build public trust, helps us bridge, through the long development to get to the elbow. Let's tell human stories when we talk to the public.
It's a great note for a journalist to hear. So that's actually a great note to end the panel on. Let's thank all of our panelists. We really put them on the spot to explain exactly when and how to communicate new technologies. But I think you all did an amazing job, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have the mic on, please. Thanks. Thank you to panel 2 for such great remarks and for a great discussion, and thanks to the audience. Now, just as we did after the first panel, we have a question for you. As you see in the instructions on the screen, just scan, the easiest thing to do is scan the QR code with your camera, or you can go to the website, that's slido.com, and use your computer or smartphone. When you're prompted for the event code, again, it's NAM 2022. And the question is, how convinced are you that scientific breakthroughs and changing paradigms in the conduct of research described today or elsewhere will lead to major paradigm shifts that really redefine science and innovation in this decade? I'll give you a minute. I could hum the Jeopardy song, but there we go. Maybe you can pop up some results. Oh. Well, I'm going to do it low tech. It looks like about 40% of us said they were said we were gave us a 4, and about 30% of us were fully convinced. So the audience was split between kind of halfway between 1 and 5, 4 and 5 in terms of being totally convinced. So that's pretty good. Thank you.